The constable had searched her home again, this time more thoroughly. No signs of struggle, no signs of packing. Her raincoat still hung by the door. Her umbrella, the one with the ivory handle shaped like a fox's head, remained in its stand. Even her handbag, famously heavy and full of correspondence, was still placed neatly on her hallway chair. Miss Marple observed it all quietly. She visited the house once more with Constable Layton, a young, well-meaning man with a fondness for procedural checklists and not much else. No forced entry, he said, reading from his notepad. No signs of departure. Kitchen window was slightly ajar. That's how the toast smell got out. But nothing disturbed. It's as if she vanished. Do you believe in people vanishing, Constable? Miss Marple asked gently. He paused, not without help. Ma'am, quite, she replied. They walked into the garden. The marigolds were beginning to wilt now, the cold creeping in. But there was something else. A patch of earth, just beyond the garden gate, appeared darker than the rest, damp, even though the rain had stopped days ago. And not just damp. Sunken. Miss Marple looked at it. Just once. But her eyes lingered long enough. Later that afternoon, a dog began to bark near the row. A spaniel, eager, high-pitched, insistent. Its owner, Mrs. Bramble, tried to quiet it as they passed Mrs. Flint's gate, but it whined and pulled toward the hedgerow behind the house. Oh, hush now, Winnie, she said. You'll wake the daffodils. But Miss Marple had already risen from her bench near the green and approached. Mrs. Bramble, she said, may I ask where Winnie usually walks? Just to the green and back. She doesn't stray far. She's drawn to something. Foxes, probably, or something foxes dig around. An hour later, Constable Layton returned with 2 colleagues and a set of spades. The patch of earth behind Mrs. Flint's marigolds gave way easily, and less than 12 inches beneath the surface, wrapped in an oilskin picnic cloth with one torn edge, they found her. Agatha Flint. Dead. Face waxen and pinched. One slipper missing, and no sign of injury. Not at first glance. The constable staggered backward. Mrs. Bramble screamed. A small group had gathered on the lane. People gasped, clutched each other, whispered, my heavens, bless her soul, and who would do such a thing? Miss Marple stood still. She said nothing, but her eyes, pale blue and rimmed with age, had already begun cataloguing. The soil, the cloth, the missing slipper, the marigolds themselves, trampled at the edge of the flower bed, as if someone had knelt, with one knee, not 2. That evening, the village rang with speculation. Poisoned, said Mrs. Banfield confidently. Always said she made enemies with those garden competition remarks. She was too nosy. Mr. Beach said at the pub. Knew too much about other people's houses. She knew my gas bill by heart. Mrs. Featherstone muttered. Never. Could figure how. Others suggested foul play from someone outside the village. A traveller, a vagrant, a cousin from London. Miss Marple, however, sat by her fire and reviewed a single fact. The earth was freshly dug. Not 3 days ago, not 2, but that morning, which meant that Mrs. Flint had not been buried when she went missing. She had been hidden and then reburied, which meant someone had returned Dot to move her, to conceal her more deeply, Dot to rewrite the story. But they had been too late. The dog had barked, and Miss Marple had seen Dot by Sunday morning. The village had bloomed with suspicion, like the first blush of fungus on damp stone, silent, spreading, and impossible to scrub away Dot at the Green Bell Tea Room. Tongues wagged over weak Earl Grey and day-old scones. I heard she was blackmailing. Someone, whispered Mrs. Larch, leaning over the sugar pot like a conspirator. A young couple. Perhaps. She always did write so many letters. Rubbish, scoffed Mrs. Dinsdale, dabbing at a raspberry smear with her serviette. She was old-fashioned, yes, but she kept to herself. I think it was a tramp, or a maniac. You know how London types pass through the lanes? Or perhaps it was a crime of passion, muttered Miss Clara Weeks, who had written precisely one romantic novel in 1978, and fancied herself the village's forgotten Bronte. A former lover returned, unfinished business, a jealous spouse. Clara, please, sighed Reverend Cobb, overhearing her. She was 82 and had arthritis in both knees, which makes her easier to push, doesn't it? Clara counted Dot by noon. The theories had multiplied like midges on a picnic. The vicar had heard she was threatening to evict the Bletchers from their cottage. The grocer insisted she'd once accused Mr. Pritchard of watering his sherry. A schoolchild swore he saw her arguing with someone tall and dark and cloaked. Though the boy's imagination had already proven less than trustworthy after his tale last Easter involving a talking goose. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took tea with Mrs. Featherstone in her back garden. The roses had already started to fall apart, brown petals dotting the tablecloth like punctuation marks. It's terrible, said Mrs. Featherstone, for the third time that hour. Simply terrible. I saw her only a day before she vanished. Tuesday afternoon, on the lane. She nodded. You know, not a smile, mind you, but a sort of acknowledgement. Was she carrying anything? Asked Miss Marple mildly. A basket, I think, or no, her handbag. Always so full of papers. Letters, perhaps. Oh yes, she wrote letters like most of us write lists. My brother said she once penned a complaint to the council about dew. Dew? She said it made the path to the churchyard slippery and disrespectful. Imagine. Miss Marple smiled politely. Later, she walked to the churchyard herself, not to the grave. There wasn't one yet, but to the bench just beyond the yew tree, where Mrs. Flint used to sit on Wednesday afternoons with her binoculars, not for bird watching, for noticing. She had once told Miss Marple, people move differently when they think they're not seen. It's in the shoulders. Now she had been moved, quietly, secretly, buried in her own Marigold bed. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple considered motives, not rage. Mrs. Flint hadn't inspired rage. Irritation, yes. Even dread. But not violence. Not unless she knew something, or had said something. A quiet word, a hint, a mailed letter, a pressure point no one expected an old woman to find, until she pressed too hard. That afternoon, Constable Layton confirmed it. The post office had intercepted an envelope addressed in Mrs. Flint's hand, posted the day she vanished but never sent. The clerk had forgotten to send it off, as it had fallen behind the till. It was addressed to Mr. Edward Langham, C.O. Langham Insurance and Sons, Chichester, Langham. The name caught like a burr in Miss Marple's mind. She had heard it recently, during a garden party, mentioned in connection with young Lorna Brand, the girl who worked as a secretary at the estate office. They're courting, you know, someone had said. But Mrs. Flint, according to several whispers, had disapproved. Why? What did she know? What had she tried to warn? Miss Marple looked down the lane toward Lorna's cottage, its shutters drawn despite the hour, and then, as if in reply, the church bell chimed once. A funeral? No, not yet. Just the hour. Just a reminder. But the gossip had already taken root, and Lorna's name now danced on its edges, barely spoken, but floating, like a shadow too quick to grasp. Theories would continue, some silly, some dangerous. And in between them, somewhere in the space between a slipper and a stamp, lay the truth. Miss Marple returned home, picked up her knitting, and thought not of suspects or suspects' stories, but of habits, the tiny repetitions that reveal what no confession ever will. Agatha Flint had been reburied. Someone had returned to the scene. Someone who knew just how deep to dig. Detective Inspector Gavin Rowntree arrived with a raincoat too crisp for local liking and shoes too polished for village lanes. His tie was crooked, though, and he had the kind of under-eye shadows that hinted at restless nights and not enough tea, which, oddly, made the villagers trust him more. He brought with him a small team, mostly to take statements, canvass the area, and walk up and down Marigold Row in conspicuous pairs, and immediately asked to speak with Reverend Cobb. As it happened, the Reverend was in the middle of preparing Sunday's sermon, which was to focus on the theme of patience. This irony was not lost on the villagers, who had been waiting days for an official inquiry and were more than ready to share every theory, memory, and passing remark they could recall. Constable Layton, familiar to all and therefore more tolerated, stood beside the inspector like a faithful spaniel, occasionally interjecting with "That's Mrs. Warburton, she gets confused," or "That one's harmless, sir," but tends to embellish. The questioning began at the vicarage, where Mrs. Cobb offered tepid tea and unrequested slices of date cake, while her husband recited the timeline of Mrs. Flint's last known movements with ecclesiastical precision. Then came the more curious calls. Mrs. Featherstone, still flustered from her earlier chat with Miss Marple, young Lorna Brand, who answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and a voice like wet paper, and finally, Miss Marple herself, who welcomed them to her drawing-room with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She sat composedly beneath a painting of violets in a jar, hands resting on her embroidery hoop. Her demeanor was gracious, respectful without being deferential, and when asked about Mrs. Flint, she simply said, "I believe she knew something she wasn't meant to." Rowntree arched a brow. "And what makes you say that, Miss Marple?" She looked up from her thread. She was a watcher, inspector, like me. We notice patterns, people walking at odd times, Letters that go out in pairs. That sort of thing. Mrs. Flint had a very steady rhythm to her days, and then, suddenly, it broke. Rowntree scribbled in his notebook. "So you think it was foul play?" "I think." Miss Marple said gently that women like Agatha Flint don't simply vanish, not without a reason. And I think she may have written something, or perhaps threatened to. Constable Layton coughed. "The letter to the insurance firm." Rowntree nodded. "We're looking into that. It might be something, or nothing at all." Miss Marple smiled without smiling. "You'll find that in villages like this, Inspector, nothing at all is often the very thing people are willing to kill for." They left soon after. Thanking her politely, she returned to her embroidery. A forget-me-not pattern this time. Appropriate, she thought. Meanwhile, outside, the police moved door to door with clipboards and ink pens, asking questions that seemed simple, but somehow never quite touched what mattered. Had anyone seen Mrs. Flint with a visitor? Did she own a garden spade? Had anyone noticed strange sounds or vehicles? They questioned Lorna Brand again, this time at her place of work, the estate office near the cricket green. She had dressed up slightly, though her eyes still looked hollow. "No," she said quietly. "She never threatened me. I mean, she always had opinions about my skirt length or my future. But that's just how she was." "Your fiancé?" Rowntree asked. "Edward Langham. Is he in town?" Lorna hesitated. "He was, but he left on Thursday. Business in Bristol." "And you're certain Mrs. Flint never mentioned him, or disapproved?" "She never said so outright. Just hints. She worried I was moving too fast, or that he was. Well, she said some men smile too much when they want something." "And what did you say?" "I said she was jealous, that no one ever smiled at her." Rowntree noted that carefully. Back on Marigold Row, theories continued like background noise. A group of children had been overheard chanting something about ghosts in the garden. Mr. Pritchard, he of the allegedly watered sherry, had disappeared into his garage for 2 full days and emerged with a suspicious limp. And Mrs. Warburton had reported strange lights in the hedgerow, though her account changed depending on the angle of the sun dot by Wednesday. A new rumor had taken hold that Mrs. Flint had been seen, or her ghost had, standing at the end of the lane. "She had her gardening gloves on," said a boy with wide eyes, "and a trowel in one hand. And she looked right at me." "Probably indigestion," his mother replied, tugging him away. But the talk unsettled people nonetheless. It was one thing to lose someone, quite another to imagine they might still be watching. At the village shop, Rowntree stood stiffly in line, pretending to browse jam while listening to 2 women debate whether or not Mrs. Flint had a secret lover from her younger days. "She had that one photo on the piano," said one. "Her cousin from Devon." "You don't know that." Miss Marple, who was selecting marmalade at the next shelf, looked up and said softly, "She never had a lover, but she did have enemies. Quiet ones. The kind who smile at you while building fences to keep you out." They looked at her, startled, and then looked away, because in St. Mary Mead, when Miss Marple spoke like that, it was rarely just a comment. It was a warning, If Agatha Flint had secrets, they were not kept in drawers. Her cottage was pristine, bordering on austere, and the constable who walked through it for the third time remarked that it smelled more like a chapel than a home. There were no personal photographs beyond one of her late father in his military uniform and a faded sepia of her as a child standing outside the old Sunday school. There were no love letters, no diaries, no coded messages tucked into books or under floorboards. But Miss Marple knew better than to search for whispers in the obvious places. The first curious item was found in her sewing box, not by the police, but by little Tilly Ware, age 8, who'd been sent to deliver scones to the Flint household before the search began, and had, out of childlike nosiness, peeked where she shouldn't. The discovery caused a stir not for what it was, but for who it concerned. It was a swatch of men's shirt fabric, fine cotton, pale blue, monogrammed, tucked inside a paper envelope with "Keep for Proof" written in a thin, spidery hand. Inspector Rowntree, when informed, narrowed his eyes. Proof of what? That question deepened after a visit to the estate office revealed that Mrs. Flint had recently requested copies of several old tenancy contracts and boundary maps, including some regarding the public garden at the end of Marigold Row. She was quite persistent, said Miss Weston. The harried clerk said the land had been misused, that something improper had gone on there. Miss Marple, who had walked over from the bakery with a packet of honey biscuits, raised her eyebrows. Did she mention what she believed had happened? Only that it was historic and that money changed hands. She seemed convinced someone had buried something, metaphorically or otherwise. This led to a brief excavation of the public flower beds, much to the irritation of the Women's Guild, who had spent a full Sunday arranging the marigolds in alternating hues. Nothing but roots and a rusted horseshoe emerged. Still, the image of Agatha Flint wandering around the garden at dusk with a notebook and an intent gaze now acquired a new meaning. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the village archives, housed in a small annex behind the church. She emerged an hour later with 2 names written in her notebook: Joseph Langham and Arthur Flint. The former had once been the proprietor of the land now known as Marigold Garden. The latter, Agatha's grandfather, had served as the land's steward during the 1890s. The records were incomplete, but one notice stood out: a brief legal dispute in 1902 about fraudulent records, quietly settled and sealed. When Miss Marple walked back down Marigold Row, the breeze smelled of cut grass and unsettled history. At the same time, Inspector Rowntree interviewed Edward Langham, fiancé of Lorna Brand and great-nephew, as it turned out, of Joseph Langham. Edward had returned from Bristol in a flurry, his alibi confirmed, but his answers thin. She was always polite to me, Edward said, folding his arms too tightly. A bit cold, but no colder than anyone else. And she never mentioned your family, Rowntree asked. Not directly, though once she said, your blood may own the lane, but it'll never own the truth. I thought it was just one of her cryptic turns. And the shirt? The inspector asked. Edward hesitated. I've had a few tailored in London. Nothing unusual, none missing Another hesitation. Miss Marple was not present at the interview, but she heard about it from Constable Layton. Over tea. She always managed to be where information flowed freely, without appearing to request it. And did you notice, Layton added sheepishly, how red his ears got when we asked about the garden, like someone lit a match behind them. That evening, as dusk settled over the rooftops, Miss Marple took her knitting into the front garden. She sat beneath a trembling lilac bush and watched the shadows gather across the path leading to Agatha Flint's cottage. The villagers were whispering more than ever. Theories swirled like chimney smoke that Mrs. Flint had once seen a murder and was blackmailing someone, that she had threatened to expose forged deeds, that she was hiding a child born out of wedlock from some decades ago. None of them were true, not exactly, but none were wholly false either. The picture emerging was of a woman who had, late in life, begun asking dangerous questions, who had kept notes, who had made copies, who had, Miss Marple suspected, mailed at least one letter to someone in authority, and who may have trusted the wrong person with her intentions. One final piece arrived via the Morning Post, a letter addressed to the diocesan land registrar, marked urgent, and stamped 3 days before Mrs. Flint vanished. It never arrived. It had been returned due to an insufficient address, and had sat, unnoticed, in the dead letter bin until an enterprising clerk spotted the return address and forwarded it. Inside, a single sentence: I am in possession of documents suggesting that Marigold Garden was unlawfully acquired and that the present benefactors, notably Edward Langham, have knowledge of this if I am not heard from within a fortnight. Consider this an indication of obstruction. Signed, Agatha Flint. Inspector Rowntree read it aloud. Miss Marple simply said she didn't disappear. She was silenced. It didn't take long for the whisper of suspicion to gather into something louder, sharper, almost a chant. Edward Langham. It began not with the police, but with a single sentence uttered over marmalade toast by Mrs. Carter at the village tea room. Well, if anyone had something to lose from Agatha's discoveries, it was him. From there, it unfurled like ivy on the wall of the pub, in corners of the post office queue, and on the benches outside the parish hall. The Langhams, after all, were old money. Not very much money anymore, but just enough to think they still owned a bit of the village, even if all they had left to show for it was the deed to Marigold Garden, a crumbling summer house, and a last name carved into the church wall. Miss Marple heard the murmurs and didn't join them. She merely sipped her tea and watched how people's mouths moved, not what they said, but how they said it, especially when Edward entered the room. He had returned to St. Aldhelm a few days after Agatha's disappearance, and was staying at the rectory as a guest of the vicar. Not quite a suspect, not yet, but certainly not embraced. He wore guilt like a misplaced button, not centered, but visible. He did try to appear cooperative. On the second morning after the letter was discovered, Edward marched into the police station and offered to show Inspector Rowntree his shirts. All of them, he said, faintly flushed, trying to appear amused. I imagine you're wondering if one's missing. The inspector, for his part, remained impassive. They laid out the shirts, 14 in total, and each bore a monogram, EL in fine. Silver thread. All present, none torn. None appeared to match the swatch in Agatha's envelope. I did have a set made some time ago in Paris, Edward admitted. But that was years past, and I gave a few away before the war. To whom? Oh, friends. Some I've lost touch with. Would Miss Flint have had access to your clothing? Edward's hesitation was measured. Only if she rifled through our bins. Miss Marple, later informed of this exchange, knit to rows of her shawl before speaking. I wonder, she said, why a woman as meticulous as Agatha would keep a fabric swatch unless she was sure of its significance. She was not sentimental. That much I know. A deeper tremor of gossip ran through the village when it was discovered that Agatha Flint had attended the last 3 parish council meetings, each time raising awkward questions about land rights and charitable leases. On each occasion, Edward had been present, and each time he'd objected with increasing sharpness. She was needling him, said Lorna Brand when asked. Honestly, she made the air crackle whenever she was near him. But I never thought it serious. She was just determined. And you? Miss Marple asked gently. Did you ever feel Agatha was a danger to your engagement? Lorna hesitated, not out of guilt, but truthfulness. I wouldn't call her a danger, but she saw everything. She could read people like books. I think she knew about Edward's frustrations, about how small he felt in his own family's shadow. Frustration can lead to recklessness. Miss Marple said, more to herself than to Lorna. What Miss Marple didn't say aloud, not yet, was that Edward Langham had once been very close to Agatha Flint's niece, long before Lorna. It had ended badly and quietly, and sometimes bitterness lingered longer than romance. By now, Rowntree was circling. He requested a search of the Langham summer house, a small, ivy-wrapped building at the far end of Marigold Garden, mostly unused. There they found little of interest, save one strange detail: a gardening glove tucked behind a stack of firewood. It was not Edward's size. Small, worn at the fingertips, with a faint smear of something that had, initially, been thought to be soil. It was ash. Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the garden when this was discovered, pretending to admire a patch of verbena. Strange, she remarked to Rowntree. When he passed, ash inside a glove implies it was worn during a fire, perhaps not a proper one. He frowned. There's no hearth here. No, she said, but perhaps a fire pit or a rubbish pile? By late afternoon, the glove had made its way to the evidence locker, and Edward had made his way back to the vicarage, where he sat, staring into an untouched supper, and declined to speak with anyone. That evening, Miss Marple visited Lorna again, not with questions, but with kindness. People say such things in times like this, she said gently. They want answers, even if they don't quite fit. Lorna looked weary. I don't know what I believe, Miss Marple. Part of me wants to believe he's innocent. Another part wonders if Agatha struck too close to something. If Edward snapped, Miss Marple did not offer comfort, only her presence, which was somehow steadier than silence. Would you like to come walking with me tomorrow morning? she asked after a pause. There's something about Marigold Row in early light. It shows you things differently. Lorna nodded Dot as they parted. Miss Marple glanced back once more at the narrow path leading from the garden to the vicarage. It was beginning to bloom again. Not with flowers, with what a village always knows, deep down. When someone has been pushed too far. It was a Sunday morning when Miss Marple set out for the walk she'd promised Lorna. The village, wrapped in its usual early hush, gave off a deceptive calm, the sort that conceals unease rather than eliminates it. Church bells rang faintly across the green, and in the gardens of Marigold Row, finches scattered through hedges like gossip passed between teacups. Lorna met her at the gate, shawled and subdued, her eyes ringed with the kind of worry that hadn't quite learned to speak yet. "I'm sorry if I seem poor company," she said as they started down the lane. "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently. Some of the best conversations happen in silence. They walked slowly past the ivy-tangled fences and rain-dark stones, where crocuses pushed out like shy truths. Occasionally, Miss Marple pointed to a bloom or a bird, offering a story that seemed offhand. A robin that had built its nest in her stovepipe once. Or a cousin who swore by crocus wine and died of it. Lorna smiled, but her hands twisted the strap of her bag. Then, as they neared the old Langham summer house, she asked, almost absently, "Did you believe Edward when he said he didn't know about the swatch?" Miss Marple gave it a moment. "I believe he didn't expect her to keep it," she said quietly, "which is not quite the same." Lorna exhaled, as though that small distinction had pierced something sealed. Inside her, they stood near the edge of the property, where a bench curved beneath a budding hawthorn. The scent of damp wood and distant ashes hung in the air. "I remember something," Lorna said suddenly. "It may be nothing. Nothing is often something in disguise," said Miss Marple. Lorna looked toward the garden path. "Agatha came to visit me 2 days before she vanished. It was drizzling. She had that little blue umbrella she never liked to share. She seemed distracted, not frightened exactly, but wary. She asked whether I'd seen anything strange at the rectory garden parties. Odd glances, side conversations. I laughed at the time. I thought she was being theatrical. But then she asked me whether Edward ever walked alone toward the summer house. She thought he was meeting someone, Miss Marple asked. Maybe, or hiding something. I asked what she was on about, and she said, "We all bury things in Marigold Row, but some of them don't stay buried." That was her last sentence to me. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the crooked summer house roof. "I wonder," she murmured, "whether the grave she meant was made of words or deeds." Later that day, the village held a modest church luncheon in the parish hall, a local tradition after the 3rd Sunday of Lent. It was the kind of event where current buns carried more weight than conversations, but Miss Marple found such gatherings immensely useful. People, she often said, showed more in their habits than in their testimonies. She took her usual seat near the corner by the window, quietly knitting a new border onto her grey shawl. From her vantage, she saw everything. The way Reverend Stowbridge avoided eye contact with the Langhams, The way the butlers whispered furiously behind napkins. The way Harriet Crimble glanced toward the front door at every creak, her fingers worrying the clasp of her handbag. And then there was Fiona Eldon, tall, severe, a widow of impeccable standing, and, more importantly, the last known friend to speak with Agatha Flint. The evening she disappeared, Fiona approached Miss Marple with a strange smile, still stitching wisdom into wool. "I see. Ah, Fiona," Miss Marple replied, without looking up. "Wisdom's too slippery for stitches, I'm afraid. But I find the pattern helps one think." Fiona folded her arms. "And what do you think, Jane?" "That depends on what's being asked." Fiona glanced around, then leaned slightly closer. "You must have heard the rumors. I make it a point to hear them," Miss Marple said lightly. "It's the only way to know when they're wrong." Fiona hesitated, then said, "Edward is a proud man, but he's not cruel." Miss Marple nodded. "Cruelty wears many faces. Pride can be one of them." A silence followed, not uncomfortable, but filled with too much unspoken thought. Miss Marple let it sit. Then Fiona added, in a voice slightly tighter than intended, "Agatha made enemies by being too clever. It's a dangerous thing. In a small village, people start wondering what you know, or what you might say, when cornered." Miss Marple placed her knitting on her lap. "And what do you suppose she knew?" Fiona opened her mouth, then closed it. "Nothing I'd repeat without a lawyer," she muttered, almost bitterly. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor with her knitting needles idle. She reviewed the day's oddities in her mind like clues in a box, a widow watching the door. With too much interest, a niece repeating an aunt's cryptic warning. A man who insists he has nothing to hide, but cannot account for what he once gave away. A glove smeared in ash, too small for Edward, too careless to be his alone. There was something there, not yet a shape, but a tension, as if the truth were a quilt tugged from both ends, and someone, somewhere, was just about to lose their grip. Miss Marple leaned back, folded her hands, and whispered to herself, "It's never the person you expect, but always the one who watched too closely." It was a tiny thing, really, almost laughably so. A handkerchief, folded twice, neatly, wedged between the roots of an overgrown hedge along the Langham property's eastern wall. The gardener, Mr. Cresswell, discovered it while pulling up brambles in preparation for the parish's spring garden competition, an annual event of such competitive pride that even Reverend Sturbridge's rose bushes had been known to receive whispered blessings. The cloth was damp, yellowed faintly with mildew, but still embroidered at the corner with a delicate monogram, A.F. Agatha Flint. When Sergeant Godfrey was called in, frowning, mustache twitching with awkward restraint, he dismissed the item almost immediately. Could have blown there weeks ago, he told Miss Marple, who had happened to be passing. By a coincidence she neither denied nor overly explained. Doesn't mean a thing. Not unless it's bloodied, torn, or whispering confessions. But Miss Marple didn't need a confession. She needed a pattern. And this handkerchief, or rather, where it was found, disrupted one. Wouldn't Agatha have kept something like this close? She asked mildly, hands behind her back. She was particular, said Mr. Cresswell. Always smelled of lavender starch, and she'd not drop it easily, Miss Marple murmured, unless she were in a hurry or frightened. The hedge in question ran behind the summer house, just before the narrow path that skirted the old mill stream. It was a place no one had any reason to visit, unless they meant not to be seen. Miss Marple bent to study the soil. The brambles were newer than the ground beneath them. Someone had tried to prune the area in haste, months ago perhaps, but had left the job unfinished. Broken branches still curled inward like hands frozen in retreat. She looked again at the handkerchief. It was folded, not dropped, intentionally placed, tucked in as if it were meant to remain or to wait. That night, in her drawing room, Miss Marple took out her small wooden case of mending needles and quietly removed a pressed handkerchief of her own, one of her late sister's, kept in a box beneath her chest of linens. She compared the stitching. Agatha's initials were looped with precision, to find to be her own work, likely commissioned. Miss Marple thought, a gift. Her mind returned to a memory from the church luncheon. Fiona Eldon's handbag. It had hung open for just a moment. Too long when Fiona reached for her compact. Inside, something blue and linen-colored, another handkerchief, or perhaps an old theatre program. Fiona had clasped it quickly, almost unconsciously, with a faint flush that didn't match the chill of the hall. Miss Marple had thought little of it at the time, but now she sat by the fire, letting the pieces arrange themselves in her mind. Agatha's monogrammed handkerchief found outside the Langham property. Fiona's unknown item folded inside her bag. The fact that Fiona and Agatha had once belonged to the same sewing circle. The fact that Fiona, sharp-eyed, always poised, claimed to have spoken with Agatha the evening she vanished, yet never mentioned where, and most telling of all, a careless phrase Fiona had let slip during their brief exchange. That afternoon, something about Agatha never sharing her umbrella. Miss Marple hadn't spoken of the umbrella. Lorna had, which meant Fiona had been listening, or watching, or both. She reached for her notebook, where she scribbled thoughts not meant for open discussion. Folded handkerchief. Not dropped. Fiona's reflex to conceal Agatha's last question. Did you ever see Edward walk alone? To the summer house? And most telling, we all bury things in Marigold Row. Perhaps someone had buried something else there. Not a body, but a truth. And Miss Marple was close to uncovering it. Seen morning at the vicarage garden. The next morning, Miss Marple took tea in the vicarage garden with Mrs. Grange, who had been lamenting her missing hyacinths and the difficulty of keeping young Thomas from trampling the herbs. Oh, it's the same every spring, Mrs. Grange sighed. They bloom, they vanish, and no one ever confesses. Rather like people, in that sense. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Do you remember the summer house party 3 months ago? She asked. Conversation allied. Mrs. Grange blinked. Of course. Such a peculiar evening. Edward insisted on starting with poetry instead of wine. Not that I minded, but it did make Fiona furious. She'd prepared a toast. Ah, said Miss Marple. I hadn't known Fiona toasted. Only when she's nervous. You can tell. She stammers. She was clutching her handkerchief so tightly. I thought she twisted to ribbons. Did it have initials on it? Miss Marple asked, eyes light. Mrs. Grange squinted. AF, I believe. But Fiona said it was a gift from an old friend who'd passed. Miss Marple paused just long enough to let the silence speak. And then she knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough to feel the first firm tug of truth beneath the tangled hedges of rumour. It was remarkable, really. How much could surface when the ground was stirred? Not just soil and roots, but secrets long buried beneath layers of routine and civility. In St. Petronella's Hollow, gossip was not idle sport. It was archaeology, and now that Agatha Flint's death hovered like a veil over the village, the villagers began their quiet excavations, with shovels shaped like teacups and gloves stitched with good intentions. Mrs. Crispin, the butcher's wife, was first to stir the pot, not her stew, but her recollections. I always said she was too sharp with Lorna, she confided loudly to the greengrocer, always correcting her posture, telling her what not to eat, even what shade of lipstick looked indecent. Controlling, she was. Like she wanted Lorna to be something she wasn't. At the hairdresser's, Miss Iris leaned over her clients, curlers, and whispered, "It's common knowledge that Agatha never truly approved of Edward Langham. Said he had the blood of a paper boy, not a poet." Meanwhile, Reverend Stowbridge struggled to maintain decorum during his sermons, his homily on secrets. For what is whispered in closets shall be shouted from rooftops, was met with a sudden cough from the third pew and averted eyes across the congregation. Fiona Eldon was notably absent from the Sunday service. That alone set tongues wagging. "She's not been herself," said Mr. Penfold, the pharmacist, nervous, pacing the shop window every morning as though expecting a telegram or a ghost. Others had noticed to Fiona had ceased attending her Tuesday bridge group. Her curtains remained drawn at midday, and most tellingly, her dog, an aging spaniel, named Pudding, had been heard howling in the night. "It's guilt," said Vera Minton with a sniff, holding her hat against the wind. "Animals always know." Miss Marple, seated calmly at the vicarage garden wall, whereupon, without comment, she didn't need to interrupt. She only needed to listen. The real tapestry of St. Petronella's was not woven from facts, but from behavior. How people tensed when a name was spoken, how they glanced too quickly away, how they corrected themselves when describing where they had been on the night of Agatha's disappearance. That, for Miss Marple, was where the threads began to show. Take young Peter Langham, for example, Edward's cousin and the one member of the family with both sense and savings. He had, until recently, been quite close to Agatha. Too close, some said, for mere cousinship by marriage. She helped him with his university debts. Miss Marple recalled Fiona saying once, with a brittle smile, "Of course, she kept the receipts." But Peter had been seen arguing with Agatha outside the post office just 3 days before she vanished, and no one had seen him cry. Then there was the matter of the land, a forgotten little parcel tucked behind the Flint property, scarcely an acre, but strategically placed between two more lucrative lots. Edward Langham had applied to the council to purchase it not once, but twice. Both applications had been rejected, the second one mysteriously withdrawn at the last minute. And who had owned that scrap of land, Agatha Flint, refused to sell, muttered Mr. Longridge, the surveyor, over his pint at the Red Hart. Said it was her hedge against the future. Whatever that meant. Now the land sat unclaimed, pending the search for Agatha's will, which, as of yet, had not been found. Seen, the Garden Society meeting Garden Society had never been a place for high drama. It was where disputes were settled over seed packets and annuals. But on that particular Wednesday afternoon, beneath the bunting of tulip garlands and the hum of distant bees, tensions bloomed. Mrs. Bartholomew presented her foxgloves with an uncharacteristic scowl. Agatha always said mine leaned left, as if flowers could be political. I dare say Agatha found most things offensive, replied Mr. Hemmings, adjusting his lapel pin shaped like a thistle. She once told me my carrots were vulgar. She told me I was vulgar, mumbled Lorna Flint. Unexpectedly, from the tea table, her voice was soft, but the room fell still. She said I smiled too wide, said I laughed like a maid and not like a lady. No one responded. The silence clung thick and awkward as treacle. I only ever wanted her to be proud of me, Lorna added, looking at her shoes. Miss Marple, who had been arranging plates of ginger biscuits, placed one gently before the girl. Sometimes, she said, we mistake criticism for care, and sometimes people hide their deepest fears inside their sharpest words. Lorna did not reply, but she didn't cry either, which, in Miss Marple's experience, meant the grief had lodged deep. And if grief was lodged deep, what else might be? Seen afternoon stroll with the Vicarlator that day. Miss Marple joined Reverend Stourbridge for a slow walk down Marigold Row. The air held the faint scent of crushed mint and chimney soot, and the vicar's pace was thoughtful. You see so much, Jane, he said after a stretch of silence. More than most of us, I think. Oh, I'm just an old woman with good hearing, she replied. He smiled. You've noticed the changes, haven't you, since Agatha's passing? It's as if the whole village has shifted. Yes, said Miss Marple, and not entirely in mourning. They paused outside the old wrought-iron gate at the edge of Flint House. Have you considered, she said gently, what people might do when someone stops holding the leash? The vicar frowned. You think Agatha held them all that tightly? No, Miss Marple said, eyes narrowing on a bent tulip that seemed oddly trampled. I think they let her, because it was easier than facing what they do without her. Sergeant Blunt, true to his name, had made up his mind. It was, in his estimation, an open and shut case. The motive was straightforward, the means plausible, and the suspect inconveniently nervous. Edward Langham, now thoroughly rattled, had walked straight into the jaws of village judgment, and Blunt was more than happy to close the trap. On Monday morning, he stood before the assembled villagers in the reading room of the town hall. An unlikely place for an official update, but one he felt gave the appropriate air of progress. We are pursuing a line of inquiry, he announced, that connects the victim's disappearance with a long-standing family dispute over property. inheritance, and financial mismanagement. Mr. Edward Langham remains under consideration. There was a rustle in the room, not gasps, but that deeper, more English form of reaction, the tightening of scarves, the rebuttoning of gloves, the sudden quiet swallowing of tea. Edward, standing near the back in a borrowed coat, turned grey. Lorna, seated beside Miss Marple, clutched her gloves with whitening knuckles. But he couldn't have done it, she whispered under her breath. Why ever not? Miss Marple replied gently, knitting still in hand. Because he's too hopeless, Lorna said, blinking. He wouldn't know how. That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the strongest argument anyone had yet made in Edward's favour. Scene: the interrogation letter that afternoon. Edward was called to the police. Cottage, blunt, sturdy, and mustachioed, had made his sitting room look vaguely official with a blotter, a mug of builder's tea, and the local map pinned to a corkboard on the wall. Tell me again, Mr. Langham, he said slowly. What time did you last see Miss Flint? I told you. Around 8 in the evening. Thursday last. She said she was going to look at the garden one last time before turning in. And you? I went for a walk. Down Marigold Row. Just needed air. I didn't go back inside. No one saw you? I don't think so. Blunt leaned back, watching him. Odd, don't you think? For a man whose aunt had just turned down his request to sell land, to go wandering alone with no one to vouch for his whereabouts? Edward's mouth opened, but no sound came. That parcel behind the house, Mr. Langham, Blunt continued, the one she refused to sell. That's a good bit of land. Now it's unclaimed. I didn't even know it was hers. Edward protested. Weakly, said Blunt. I'll need your shoes. Scene: Village Ripplesby. Tuesday. Edward had become a pariah in the polite way only English villagers know how to enact. His newspaper. Deliveries stopped arriving. The baker forgot his order of rye. Children no longer waved as he passed Dot at the Red Hart. Murmurs hummed like flies over jam. He never liked Agatha, someone said. I heard he was in debt, said another. He asked after the will before. The body was found. It was untrue, of course, but facts were brittle things under the weight of whispered certainty. Even Fiona Eldon, usually restrained, was heard to remark while paying for thread at the haberdasher, he never came to church. Did he? The village had decided. It was Edward, and they would be polite about it until he was gone. Scene: Miss Marple and the cat Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken tea in her own drawing-room with her nephew Raymond West, who had come down for a literary retreat and stayed for the gossip. It's a delicious little drama, he said, pouring the milk. A vanished aunt, a nervous nephew, some unspoken resentments. It's practically one of my novels. Then perhaps you can tell me the ending, said Miss Marple with a smile. Raymond chuckled. Well, the nephew did it, naturally. But if he did, she said, selecting a scone, why was the soil beneath the petunias recently dug after the disappearance? Raymond paused. What do you mean? There were no new plantings, she continued, eyes sparkling. Yet the soil was disturbed, and the gardener, Mr. Hollow, Hasn't returned from his sisters in Devon these last 2 weeks. So, someone else dug. Yes, and not very well. The root systems were distressed. Raymond raised an eyebrow. And you're basing this on the way the petunias look. Petunias are terribly revealing, Miss Marple said lightly, like certain types of people. Overwatered and underloved. Raymond blinked. Aunt Jane, you're terrifying. Scene. A visit to Fiona Eldon Wednesday brought with it an unexpected visit. Miss Marple, never one for confrontation, took a warm currant cake and walked up the steep path to Fiona Eldon's ivy-covered cottage. The woman opened the door in a cardigan far too thick for spring and eyes that looked as if they hadn't closed in days. Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting dew come in. Inside, the sitting room smelled of bergamot and starch. Fiona cleared a stack of neatly ironed linens from the settee and poured tea with trembling hands. Such a dreadful business, she murmured, not quite meeting Miss Marple's eyes. Yes, said Miss Marple gently, and I fear the wrong man is about to be punished. Fiona blinked. Edward? He may be a fool, Miss Marple went on, but fools rarely make such neat work of hiding a body. Fiona paled. I never said, she began, then stopped. You didn't have to, said Miss Marple, setting down her cup. There was silence, broken only by the faint tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. Agatha was cruel, Fiona said suddenly. To Lorna, to Edward, to me, most of all. She held everything over me, every mistake I ever made. Every letter, every debt. Miss Marple waited. I didn't kill her, Fiona whispered, but I wished her gone. I wished it every day for a year. Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. So did half the village, my dear. But only one person had the courage or the desperation to act on it. Fiona looked up sharply. And it wasn't Edward, Miss Marple finished. Scene, Sergeant. Blunt receives a visitor that evening. Sergeant Blunt sat at his desk, paperwork in a disorderly heap, satisfaction curling at the edge of his mouth. He was preparing the arrest recommendation for Edward Langham when the door opened. Miss Marple entered, hat perfectly pinned, her knitting bag slung over one arm. I believe, she said pleasantly, that you are about to make a rather large mistake. Blunt stared. Beg pardon? She set a single object on the desk, a pair of worn gardening gloves. These were found behind the compost heap, she said. Far too small for Edward. And, she added, pointing to the faint stain on the leather, still slightly damp with soil. Mixed soil, the kind used only in potting, not bedding, which means the body wasn't buried where the petunias were. Blunt frowned. It means, she said, someone moved it, someone very tidy. The village of Marlington awoke on Thursday morning to a fresh ripple of horror. It began with the grocer's boy, Thomas, who arrived at the post office to find the door slightly ajar and the curtain twitching in the wind. Inside, everything appeared orderly until he glanced behind the counter. Mrs. Tibbins, the postmistress of 23 years and keeper of more secrets than the vicar's ledger, was slumped in her chair. A faint trickle of blood had dried at her temple, and beside her hand lay an envelope, unposted, sealed, and marked only with the word confession. By noon, the post office had been cordoned off, and Sergeant Blunt was red in the face, muttering about tampered evidence and the press. Dr. Henshaw had declared the wound possibly self-inflicted, though unlikely, and villagers circled the building like buzzards in beige cardigans. Miss Marple stood quietly beside the tulip cart outside the greengrocer's, a bag of dried apricots hanging from her wrist. She wasn't looking at the post office. She was watching the faces that looked at the post office. Lorna Flint, drawn and pale. Fiona Eldon, curiously blank. Edward Langham, trembling. And young Sylvia Parish, frowning just a little too hard, as if rehearsing sadness. Scene, the unposted. Letter Sergeant Blunt called Miss Marple in at 3:30, his pride clearly in his boots. The letter had been addressed, though not mailed, to one Miss Jane Marple, Church Lane. It read, "Dear Miss Marple, I write this only because I believe you already suspect the truth, and because you will understand better than most why. I did what I did. I did not kill Agatha, but I know who did. I know, because I helped them bury the body. It was in the name of mercy, but mercy is not the same as justice. I'm afraid I have not the courage to name them. Not in writing. Not yet. But I thought you should know Edward is innocent. Forgive me." A friend Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it delicately and handed it back. "Well," Blunt demanded. She regarded him with her usual patience. "If Mrs. Tibbins truly wrote this, then the situation is more complicated than we thought. If she did not," her gaze moved to the desk drawer. "May I?" Blunt opened it. Inside were the usual odds and ends of village life: string, stamps, invoices, and a tin of barley sugar. Miss Marple removed a second envelope, one crumpled, torn at the flap, and sniffed. Lemon. Her stationery always had lemon oil. This one does not. So either she wrote the letter earlier, on different paper, or someone wanted us to think she did. Blunt narrowed his eyes. "You think the letter was planted? I think someone wanted to stop her from speaking." Scene. Sylvia's quiet slips that afternoon. Miss Marple asked Lorna to accompany her on a short visit to the vicarage garden. It wasn't an unusual invitation. Miss Marple was fond of small walks, especially when a pressing thought needed airing. In safe company, they found young Sylvia Parish seated near the bird bath, trimming a bouquet of forget-me-nots. Sylvia's eyes widened. "I never said where." "No, dear," Miss Marple said softly. "You didn't." Scene. The trap closes. Mrs. Tibbins came to see me the night before her death, Miss Marple said, turning her gaze to Fiona. She was frightened, not of Sylvia, but of what might happen next, of the silence. She said something terrible had been buried. Figuratively, asked the Reverend, uncertain. Literally, said Miss Marple. Behind the post office gate, a pair of shoes, Sylvia's, blood-stained. Sylvia whimpered. Fiona's hand flew to her mouth. She wanted to confess, but someone convinced her not to. Miss Marple leaned forward. "That someone," she said gently, "was you, Fiona?" Fiona stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "You can't prove that." "No," Miss Marple agreed. But you just did. Scene. The final thread. Fiona backed away from the table. She was just a child. She snapped. What was I supposed to do? Let them arrest her? Let her life end over one tragic moment? Miss Marple stood to, her hands steady on the tablecloth. No, but you were supposed to tell the truth, not create a lie large enough to kill someone else. Mrs. Tibbins couldn't bear the guilt. That's why she poisoned herself. Fiona shook her head. She was weak. No, Miss Marple said. She was brave. Braver than either of us. Scene. Aftermath at the Gatletta that evening. Sergeant Blunt escorted Fiona Eldon to the station. She didn't resist. She didn't even cry. She simply walked, with the measured calm of someone who had always expected to be punished, and had finally run out of clever ways to avoid it. Sylvia remained at Miss Marple's cottage for a while, staring into the fire with hollow eyes. I didn't mean for any of this, she said quietly. No one ever does, said Miss Marple. But we are still responsible for it. Sylvia nodded. What will happen to me? Miss Marple placed a hand on her shoulder. You'll live. You'll be watched. And you'll have to grow into a person who doesn't hide from the truth. The truth, as Miss Marple often said, is rarely shouted. It sighs. It mutters. It stumbles out when someone forgets to be careful. And Fiona Eldon had been careful for a long time. Not just during the investigation, but for years before. Careful in her garden, careful in her bookkeeping, careful in her every smile. She had learned, as many women do, that to survive in a village like St. Chad's Hollow, one must be as precise as lace and twice as invisible. Which is why Miss Marple knew the truth couldn't be found in facts, but in something much smaller, a word. Misplaced. Scene. One last visited was 2 days after the tea trap. Fiona had not yet been formally charged. Sergeant Blunt was conferring with higher-ups in Chedcombe. And in the meantime, Fiona remained in her home on Marigold Row, watched discreetly. Miss Marple arrived under the pretense of returning a book. Poisonous Shrubs of Southwest England, ironically enough, and brought with her a jar of plum preserves. It was too late for the plums, of course, but no one turned down a jar from Miss Marple. Fiona received her stiffly. Have you come to twist the knife? She asked, leading her to the sitting room. Goodness, no, said Miss Marple. I find knives very distressing, though I must admit, I have always been fascinated by the way people unravel when they think they've held the thread too long. Fiona said nothing. She stood by the fireplace, her posture perfect, her mouth pinched into a firm line. Miss Marple glanced around. The room was impeccable. Not a speck of dust, not a single book out of line. But it was cold, even with the fire. I was thinking, Miss Marple said casually, about how very brave it was of you, protecting Sylvia like that. Fiona's mouth twitched. She's like a daughter to me, she said. I couldn't let her throw her life away over something she didn't mean to do. Of course, said Miss Marple. But you didn't bury the shoes. That caught Fiona off guard. What? You didn't bury them? Sylvia did. It was her guilt, her panic. And you found out, didn't you? You tried to fix things, but too late. Fiona didn't respond. Her face was unreadable now. Miss Marple continued, "What I find most curious, you see, is what Mrs. Tibbins wrote in her last letter, the one the vicar handed me." Fiona blinked. "I thought the letters were destroyed." And there it was, a sentence, a small one, but one she couldn't have known. Miss Marple sat back gently in her chair. Seen the realization no one said the letters were destroyed. Miss Marple said softly, "Only that they hadn't been found." Fiona's lips parted slightly, but no words came. "It was a clever fire," Miss Marple went on, "set late at night. A small one in the hearth in Mrs. Tibbins' own sitting room. A poor, panicked attempt to remove the letter she'd written and then hidden." Fiona sat down suddenly, as if her legs no longer trusted her. "I didn't mean for her to die," she whispered. "No," said Miss Marple. "But she was terrified, and you gave her the final push." Seen, the unspooling Fiona spoke slowly now, the precision gone from her voice. "She came to me. She was shaking. Said Sylvia had confessed. Said she couldn't live with it. I told her to give me the letter, that I'd take care of it. You meant to destroy it. I did destroy it, but she must have written another. Or she kept a copy. I thought if I said enough, did enough, it would be buried, like everything else." Miss Marple nodded. "Like your husband's debts. Like the misappropriated funds from the church garden fund. Like the affair between Mr. Kerrer and your sister. You have such a tidy way with unpleasantness." Fiona looked up sharply. "How long have you known?" "I didn't," Miss Marple said. "But I wondered who would be skilled enough to make poison look like old age and guilt, and who had access to the right plants." Fiona covered her mouth with her hand. She began to cry, but they were not frantic tears. They were quiet, resigned, like an apology spoken too late to matter. Seen outside in the Laniers Miss Marple left. The clouds were low, and the sky threatened spring rain. Sergeant Blunt waited near the gate, watching as she approached. "Well?" he asked. She said it. "Enough for a charge. I imagine you'll want to record it properly. But yes, she gave it away. Just one sentence too many." Blunt exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. "Do you ever get used to it, Miss Marple?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "You just learn to listen better. It was not the kind of day one expected for such a reckoning. Bright sun on daffodil banks, birds chirping like it was all quite ordinary. But St. Chad's Hollow, like many English villages, had a peculiar talent for appearing untouched even when its foundations had been shaken. The drawing room at the vicarage had been set with quiet dignity, a tray of tea things on the low table, lemon biscuits on the doily-lined plate. The fire burned politely in the hearth, and the lace curtains shifted with the occasional breeze through the cracked window. Sergeant Blunt stood near the fireplace, arms folded, eyes trained on the woman in the armchair. Fiona Eldon was pale, but composed, hands folded in her lap, her lips pressed into the shape of someone who had made peace with the inevitable. Seated across from her, knitting needles idle in her lap, sat Miss Marple. Also present were the vicar and Mrs. Weatherby, acting as witnesses, and Miss Marple suspected. Also because the moral fabric of the village would not withstand such a scandal. passed through hearsay alone. The silence was gentle, until Miss Marple cleared her throat. "Let us begin," she said, voice clear but soft, as though she were telling a parable. "There is a temptation in villages like ours to believe that what lies beneath the soil should stay there. Secrets, once buried, often grow roots deeper than anyone expects. And when we dig them up, we're surprised that they still breathe." She looked toward Fiona, who did not meet her gaze. "It began, of course, with the shoes," Miss Marple continued. "A child's shoes, small, patent leather, found in a shallow grave by young Annan Carter's spaniel in Marigold Row. Shoes belonging, it turns out, to Emily Denham, the little girl who vanished 17 years ago, never to be seen again." There was a murmur from Mrs. Weatherby, who clutched her teacup. "They had been buried recently," Miss Marple went on. "Not when Emily disappeared. And it struck me as odd that Sylvia Morton, Fiona's companion and tenant, should be the one to unearth them, so to speak." Fiona's jaw tensed. Sylvia panicked. Miss Marple said kindly she had no idea what had happened to Emily, but she did remember playing with her that summer and teasing her, as children do. When the child disappeared, Sylvia was told to forget it, and she did, until the shoes brought it all back. Miss Marple paused. "So she dug them up, not out of guilt, but fear. And Fiona saw it happen, knew what it might mean, knew what she had to do to protect the girl she'd come to love like a daughter." Fiona's voice cracked, barely audible. "She didn't kill her." "No," said Miss Marple, "she didn't. But you did." The room stilled. Miss Marple's eyes, blue and unwavering, rested on Fiona. "Emily had seen you," she said softly. "Seen you kissing your sister's husband, Mr. Carrow, near the edge of the field. Children wander, you see, and they remember things no one expects them to." Fiona inhaled sharply, as though struck. She threatened to tell. Miss Marple continued. In her child's voice, she repeated what she had seen. She thought it was a game. "But you knew, if your sister found out, if the village found out, it would ruin you both. So you took Emily for a walk. You gave her something sweet-laced, with foxglove, extracted carefully from your garden, and you buried her where no one would find her. Not until the soil shifted years later. I didn't mean..." Fiona's voice broke. She wouldn't stop laughing. "I told her it was just a joke, but she kept saying she'd tell. That Mummy would cry. That she'd tell the whole village." Miss Marple nodded, her voice even. "I don't believe you intended to kill her. You wanted to frighten her into forgetting. But the dose was too much." Fiona looked down at her hands. "She told me she felt sick." Fiona whispered, "I didn't know what to do. I panicked. When she fell asleep, I thought she'd wake up, but she didn't. And so you buried her," said Miss Marple gently, "near the fence, under the marigolds. And you carried it, year after year, until the shoes surfaced, and you realized someone else knew. Mrs. Tibbins," Fiona said quietly. "She found the old scarf, the one I used to carry Emily's things, in the shed. I had meant to burn it, but I forgot. She wrote to the vicar," said Miss Marple, confessing what she suspected. And when she told you, I asked for the letter, Fiona said. Told her I'd deal with it. She gave it to me. But I didn't know she'd written a second one. She was frightened of what she knew. You visited her again, Miss Marple said, and set the fire. Just a few flames in the hearth. Enough to destroy evidence. Not enough to harm her. Or so you thought. Fiona didn't deny it. She had a weak heart, she said, eyes wet now. I didn't think. I just wanted it to go away. The room was heavy with silence. The vicar looked stunned. Mrs. Weatherby's hand was trembling. Sergeant Blunt stepped forward. Mrs. Eldon, I'll have to ask you to come with me. Fiona stood slowly. Do what you must, after Mathliter. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her window, knitting resting in her lap. Outside, the marigolds in the garden bobbed in the wind, orange and yellow, bright and oblivious. The truth, she thought, is rarely neat. It doesn't come wrapped in ribbon. It frays at the edges. It hurts. But it was better than silence. Always. Better than silence. The days that followed Fiona Eldon's quiet confession passed in a strange, suspended hush. It wasn't like the aftermath of a storm. No, storms left debris and noise. This was something else, something quieter, like the village had collectively inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The spring breeze still ruffled the hedgerows. The post still arrived at 10:30. The bells of St. Chad's still rang on Sunday morning. But something in the way people moved, spoke, and even walked past one another had changed. It was as though everyone in the village had begun seeing each other with new eyes. At the Vicar Roger Everend, Hale found himself looking longer into the mirror each morning, not to check his collar or hair, but to search his own expression, wondering if, like Miss Marple, he'd ever really seen the people in his parish. He had read Fiona's letter again and again. The second copy Mrs. Tibbins had hidden behind a hymn book, then quietly handed over to him before her death. He'd questioned whether he had missed something, some flicker in Fiona's voice during her readings, some tremble in her hands during communion. She sat right here every week. He murmured aloud in his study, where dust motes floated through shafts of warm light, and none of us ever knew. At the post officers, Weatherby, ever the village thermometer, could not help but keep tabs on who said what and who didn't say anything at all. It's a tragedy, yes, she told Mr. Hemmings as she sorted the telegrams, but I dare say it's a lesson too, about what secrets do when they fester underground. Mr. Hemmings grunted, less interested in morality and more concerned with the fact that Fiona had once made him marmalade. He found the jar in his pantry. Unopened. He threw it away. Among the youth Sylvia Morton, now the subject of unwanted glances and barely disguised pity, walked daily down the lane toward the greengrocer's, as if to prove she still belonged. She didn't kill anyone, Miss Marple said once, firmly, to a tea companion who had murmured something about bad apples. No, the friend replied, abashed. But how does one forget something like that? Children are trained to forget, said Miss Marple softly, especially when adults tell them to. Sylvia, for her part, had changed. The bounce in her step had dulled, but there was steel beneath the sadness now. a quiet defiance. She had faced something terrible, and she had survived. Not everyone did. At the police station, Sergeant Blunt, not usually a man given to reflection, sat longer at his desk than usual that week. He found himself flipping through old case files, rereading reports he'd once considered open and shut. He paused longest over Emily Denham's file, thin, incomplete, full of question marks and assumptions. Always seemed odd. He muttered, "No signs of abduction. Just vanished. We should have looked closer." But no one wanted to suspect. A quiet, well-kept young woman like Fiona Eldon back then. She was a school teacher. She baked. She attended choir. Funny, he said aloud, to no one. We never thought to ask why she left teaching so soon after Emily disappeared. In the churchyard, a modest headstone now stood for Emily Denham. Her remains had been recovered, gently identified, and given the dignity denied her for nearly 2 decades. Children stopped to look at the flowers. Parents walked by more slowly. No one hurried past Marigold Row anymore. At Miss Marple's cottage end. What of Miss Marple? She returned to her garden, planted marigolds of her own. Not to forget, but to remember. She took tea on her porch, alone more often than not, her thoughts deep in the teacup swirl. She didn't gloat, didn't speak much of what had transpired. If anyone asked how, she knew. She'd smile vaguely and say, "Oh, it's amazing what one notices when you've had a lifetime of listening." But she watched the village more closely now, not out of suspicion, but empathy. Fiona Eldon hadn't been a monster, just a woman who'd made a terrible, irreversible mistake, and who'd lived each day with the silent ache of it. She hadn't wanted to be cruel, but she had been weak, and fear, Miss Marple knew, was often the wick at the heart of human tragedy. A letter found weeks later, while clearing out Fiona's rented cottage for legal inventory. Sylvia came across a sealed envelope in a drawer. It was addressed to Miss Marple. She brought it, hand trembling slightly, and waited as Miss Marple read it by the sitting room window. It was brief, a single page. "Dear Miss Marple, you were right, of course. You always are. But thank you for letting me speak before you did. It mattered, somehow. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I hope the marigolds grow bright this spring." Effie Miss Marple folded the letter, tucked it into her book of psalms, and said nothing. Some truths didn't need to be spoken again. Life resumed in much withering, as life always does, not with fanfare, but with the quiet insistence of routine. The rain returned, first in small, indecisive drizzles, then in the steady rhythm that dampened fences, dappled hedgerows, and sent the smell of turned earth drifting through the village. Lanes. The bakery reopened its doors after a week of mourning. The milk was delivered. The bells of St. Chad's rang again, not for a funeral, but for a wedding rehearsal. Someone's cousin from Devon marrying a solicitor from Eastbourne. Life, it seemed, was eager to move forward. And yet, the faces at the market were slightly different, not in their shape or color, but in how they turned toward one another. Slower, more cautious. Conversations lasted a little longer. People asked, "How are you?" and actually listened. The weather, at least, had not changed its tone. But the village had Mrs. Weatherby, for once in her life, had nothing to say. She had tried. Of course, she had rehearsed the sentences in her head. Some people are simply born to keep things to themselves. Terribly tragic. Poor Miss Eldon. But one must wonder how she slept at night. I always thought there was something a bit off about her cakes. Too symmetrical. But, in the end, none of it rang true. And even she, gossipy, opinionated Mrs. Weatherby, had to admit that silence was, perhaps, the more respectful offering. She began knitting again. Something about rows of orderly stitches comforted her in a way words could not. Reverend Halith Reverend's sermons grew quieter, no longer full of bold proclamations and polished metaphors. They now sounded more like meditations, meandering, thoughtful, and hesitant in a way that made people lean in to hear. He spoke one Sunday of compassion without curiosity, of kindness without need for understanding, of the weight people carried beneath polite smiles. And as he looked out over his congregation, some wiping their eyes, others sitting unusually still, he knew, for the first time, that the village was truly listening. Sylvia Morton Sylvia, changed most of all. Not in appearance. She still wore her sensible cardigans, still kept her hair in the same unremarkable bob. But something internal had hardened and clarified. She no longer flinched when she saw school children laughing. She no longer crossed the street to avoid Mrs. Weatherby or shrank into her coat. In front of the bakery, she walked tall. Sometimes she lingered by Emily Denham's grave. Not out of guilt, but remembrance. She brought a single marigold, bright and golden as flame, and stood without speaking for several minutes. No one asked why. No one needed to Miss Marple. She gardened her marigolds, bright, precise, cheerful, bloomed in perfect order. She clipped the dead heads, tied back the climbing roses, and kept her eyes open for blight, for signs of rot beneath healthy leaves. She had seen it all before, not just in this case, but in so many others. Deaths born not of hatred, but of fear. Crimes committed not in malice, but in desperate silence. The truth of Fiona Eldon and Emily Denham and young Sylvia Morton would never be written in any official chronicle. No brass plaque would be mounted. No London paper would print their names. But Miss Marple remembered, and she would make sure the village did too. In small ways, a donation to the school under Emily's name. A basket of apples quietly left for Sylvia's mother. A book on healing handed to the vicar, with a knowing look. One last visitor-own morning, as the mist rose off the grass like breath, a man came knocking at Miss Marple's cottage. He was tall, soft-spoken, with a worn leather bag and a hesitant air. A relative of Fiona's, he explained, a cousin. He had come to collect what little remained of her belongings and sort the affairs she had left tangled behind. He didn't ask much, didn't speak of guilt or shame or the family's name. But before he left, he turned to Miss Marple and said, "Thank you for giving her the dignity of telling the truth, even if it cost her everything." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe," she said softly, "that truth does not cost us anything in the end. Only lies do." He smiled, a sad, grateful thing. and disappeared down the lane. And the village, Marigold Row, remained quiet. The ivy continued its slow conquest of the fence near number 11. Children still ran past it without looking too closely. The sun returned in patches, filtering through clouds as though testing the village's readiness for brightness again. People remembered, and then, in the way all places do, they slowly forgot, not the facts, but the sharpness of feeling. And that was all right, because somewhere in the mind of Jane Marple, every thread remained catalogued, every stitch, every whispered doubt, every vanished girl and hidden guilt. And she would remember it, not with judgment, but with understanding. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Miss Marple remembered the date, because she had just poured herself a second cup of lapsing Sokong and was debating whether to prune the hydrangeas before. Or after lunch. It bore no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was spidery, but deliberate, the kind that hinted at someone who had once written often and beautifully, but had long since stopped. She opened it without hurry. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. Heavy stock, faint lavender scent. Miss Marple, you do not know me, at least not properly. We have never been formally introduced, though I once passed you on the platform at Wexham Station and nearly said hello. You were reading the paper. I was too afraid. I write now not for clarity. The truth, I know, has already been uncovered, but because I wished to say that someone knew. Someone always did. Emily and I were friends once. Real ones, before things became difficult. Before adults started choosing what we were allowed to be. We shared a pencil case. We passed notes in Latin class. We told each other secrets under the clock tower. I saw the change in her, not just in school, but at church, in the village hall, in the way her smile fell short of her eyes. I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I must have misunderstood. When she died, I grieved, but I also exhaled. That's the worst part of all, I think. The moment of relief, that I didn't have to speak after all. Years pass. Shame fades, but never leaves. I moved away, built a life, but I never went near marigolds. Not once, not a single flower, until yesterday. A neighbor brought some over. I nearly sent them back, but instead I sat with them, looked at them for a long time, and thought of you, of what you did, not to punish, but to uncover, to unearth something long buried. Thank you for helping the truth breathe again. Yours, a friend of Emily's. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box. Beneath her sitting room window, the one lined with old lace handkerchiefs and brittle telegrams, a record of the forgotten and the unforgettable. She did not weep. She did not sigh, but she did something rare. She set aside her tea, walked to the window, and opened it wide, letting the afternoon air, warm and scented with early autumn, drift through the room like a memory to long held in. Outside, Marigold Row sat still, rain-soaked, yes, and a little battered, but not broken. Not anymore.